But now let's move on to some of, just kind of the more common drugs that we're all familiar with, the ones that make a ton of money on the black market, the ones that I'm sure maybe some of you have had experience using, maybe not. But first, we're going to talk about the most well-known, cannabis. Well, I don't know about the most well-known, but, So cannabis, actually, hemp, the non-smokable version of cannabis, the one that doesn't get you high. Hemp has actually been farmed, we found, for over 10,000 years. People have been farming that in the Asian region, in the Mediterranean. People have been farming hemp for tens of thousands of years. And actually, the medicinal use goes back 5,000 years to Emperor Xin Nang of China, who used the smokable form of cannabis to treat gout, malaria. And this is hilarious. He treated it for poor memory as well, which we know cannabis can often be the cause of poor memory. So, but with medicine, there's a lot of trial and error. So, nobody's perfect. But again, we've been farming hemp, because hemp can be used to make ropes and all different types of product. We've been farming hemp for over 10,000 years, and we've been using cannabis medicinally. Records have shown for over 5,000 years. Medicinal use spread all over Asia and Europe over the next 3,000 years. Cannabis plantations actually used to be all over the United States. And by the 1800s, it was traded worldwide. So cannabis and hemp was like a worldwide commodity by the 1800s. People have been using it for thousands of years, but as the world became more connected through trade, it became something that the United States made a ton of money off of as well. And so so again, that's kind of a brief history of that before I get into like laws changing, because the laws for cannabis and cocaine and heroin and stuff like that, a lot of them kind of go hand in hand. So now, before we get in, again, to how the law started changing, I want to go over briefly, we've been farming hemp and using cannabis medicinally for a very long time. Now we get into opium, and opium actually has been used for pretty much the same amount of time as hemp and cannabis from people. Their poppy seeds were found in European settlements dating back to the early Neolithic age. And the Neolithic period is basically when sophisticated stone tools were being used. People were dependent on domesticated plants and animals. Permanent settlements started to come around. So people have been planting poppy since basically the dawn of civilization. And then we have early opium artifacts found from 6 millennium BC, which is 8,000 years ago. Domesticated poppy seeds found in ancient Italian settlements from the same period. And as far back as writing goes, people have actually been writing about opium. There's been Sumerian tablets found from 2000 BC on how to grow opium, how to use opium. And actually, back in those times, Egypt, they made a ton of money transporting opium because they actually had some of the highest quality in the world at the time. And they would sell it to the Phoenicians and the Minoans, and then that poppy would end up elsewhere throughout the world, in Carthage, Greece, Europe, and what have you. And so, we started to see the development of things like morphine and heroin. Heroin actually was developed as the UK uses it the same way that the United States uses morphine. And the development of that actually was pretty interesting because in 1804, that's when morphine was first isolated from opium. Because with opiates are like morphine, codeine, and then opioids are the synthetic medicines that are made from opiates. And morphine obviously is very addictive. It has withdrawal symptoms. So in an attempt to develop a product that was less addictive with less withdrawal symptoms, diacetylmorphine was invented, which actually is just heroin. And of course, that is even more potent as morphine and even more addictive and has even worse withdrawal symptoms. And unfortunately, heroin was successfully sold to the German government by the Bayer Pharmaceuticals. They basically just said, look, this is a better option than morphine. The German government bought it. And between 1900 and 1920, heroin was used medicinally for things like curing coughs and stuff like that. And then they ended up taking it off the shelves. But by that time, heroin had been discovered and was a worldwide black market product. And diacetylmorphine, again, that's heroin, is still actually used in the UK for, it's basically used like morphine. So examples of opioids that come from the opiates of that would be like oxycodone, Percocets, hydrocodone, Vicodin, fentanyl, which is 50 times more powerful than heroin. Those are all examples of opioids. And actually 70% of the world's poppy supply comes from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the other 30% is grown and controlled by the Mexican cartels. So now we're going to get into cocaine. So cocaine actually comes from the coca leaf, as I'm sure you're familiar with, and Native Americans in South America, they've been chewing on the coca leaf for well over 1,000 years. They've been chewing on it. Cocaine is an alkaloid that's in the coca leaf, so they chew on it to give them more energy. And there's also other nutrients and alkaloids within the coca leaf that was a benefit for them to chew on. And today, 75% of cocaine is grown in Colombia, and it's also grown in Peru and Bolivia. And this is actually, the early Spanish conquerors, when they first came, they called the chewing of the leaf an act of the devil. But then, of course, they legalized it and taxed it, because, this may be an act of the devil, but we're going to make some money off the act of the devil, which I guess, we could learn a thing or two from in terms of legalizing it, making some money off of it. Obviously, the parallels are quite different, and we don't want to go down that path. However, despite them saying that it was evil, they still made some tax dollars off of it. But interestingly enough, the actual isolation of the cocaine alkaloid, that wasn't achieved until 1855 by a German chemist named Friedrich Gauck, and he called it erythaxylene. That's when, again, the actual process for removing the cocaine alkaloid from the coca leaf. And after that, in 1879, Western chemists began conducting experiments with the cocaine, and it was mostly used medicinally as an anesthetic, to numb different areas, for toothaches, to numb areas, to go into surgery. But now cocaine really doesn't have very many medicinal uses the same way that it did. But it became popular in literature in the late 1800s, and it actually used to be sold in local drugstores in the early 20th century for 5 to 10 cents for small boxes. And white laborers actually used to encourage their black workers to use cocaine, obviously, because cocaine is a stimulant. It takes your appetite away, stuff like that. It would help them to stay working. But then, as that started to be outlawed, again, I'm going to come back to all the laws being changed, because the outlawing of cannabis and cocaine and stuff like that kind of all go off of the same type of theme. So I'm going to get there in a sec. But just in terms of, so you can look at how much money this stuff makes on the black market, it costs about $1,000 a kilo in cocaine, in Colombia, rather, $1,000 a kilo. But when you move that here, they can be sold for $25,000 to $30,000 a kilo, and that can be broken down into, $100,000 if you break it down into grams and $100 grams. So, again, this type of stuff makes a ridiculous amount of money on the black market, and we're not seeing any of those tax dollars. And I'm going to go over some of those statistics about how nothing's really changing. Rather, people are going up in their usage. And again, in today's podcast, I'm not even talking about alcohol prohibition at all. I'm just talking about drugs. And then we have psychedelics. We have things like psilocybin, which is a natural occurring compound found in magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, MDMA, and the usage of hallucinogens that goes back far beyond recorded history. The same amount of time as people have been using cannabis, same amount of time as people have been using poppy seeds. And since a lot of these compounds are found in, like naturally occurring fungus, it's safe to say that people have been doing hallucinogenic drugs for longer than they've been doing anything else, as they can be naturally found and don't have to be farmed and cultivated necessarily, or things like that. Now, the thing about psychedelics is there's a lot of potential benefits for mental health. Whether that be treating addiction, OCD, anxiety, depression, and things along those lines. And mental health treatment has remained largely stagnant since the 80s, and it's mostly just been utilizing psychotherapy and something called SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which can be very habit-forming and addictive. And the thing about using, things like psilocybin and psychedelics, because they've been shown to help to reduce depressive symptoms and help people to get a hold of their addiction, is that, you got to think that the antidepressant drug market, that's a $16 billion drug market. And part of the way that, these pharmaceutical companies make their money is people continue, whether it be out of pocket or insurance, they continue to buy the medication, they continue to buy the products. But with things like psilocybin and psychedelics, you're not continuously buying that, which means that the usage of psychedelics is not of financial benefit to big pharma. And because of that, we see most of the research into psychedelics either being conducted privately or rarely through government funding. So this is going to have to be something where the culture pushes it forward and gets lumped into the tax benefits of things like legalizing cocaine or legalizing, further legalizing cannabis around the United States, things like that. Because again, there's for instance, a Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine study of 15 smokers found that 80% of them abstained from smoking for 6 months after just a single psilocybin treatment. So again, we're looking at real results, but after one treatment. And the research shows that what happens is when you're high on, psychedelics, your brain, the connections in your brain are basically going ham. They're going crazy. And when your high goes down, some of those connections basically realign themselves in a more proper way. So like when you're depressed or when you're really anxious or when you're going through something, your hormones, your chemical, the chemical balance can be out of whack in your brain, and your connections can be a little off. And research shows that things like psilocybin help to realign that. Another study from the Archives of General Psychiatry showed 12 cancer patients with end-of-life anxiety showed lower scores of depression tests overall. And, obviously, nothing's perfect. So, but the problem is that since these tests aren't necessarily publicly funded, we can't continue to do the research. So again, this is going to have to be something that the culture pushes forward as we push for the legalization of other drugs. However, one of the bigger benefits with pushing for the legalization of psychedelics is that it has more direct health benefits than things like the legalization of like cocaine or something. Ultimately, there's a lot that we have to talk about.